didn't like it.
He didn't like it?
I don't know. Did he not like it?
He laughed.
Well, he must have liked it then.
To highlight in his book. So what we have tonight is really an effort to celebrate a major achievement of political writing. That we have someone who is focused, as did Jesus, on the most vulnerable, on the other. And he's done it in a way that is compelling. He's done it in a way that cannot be ignored. And it is a reminder, once again, of how valuable Chris Hedges is and how lucky we are to have him as, he hates for me to use the word, but indeed to have him as a prophetic thinker. Chris Hedges.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sonali and Blaze and Bob. Those are certainly three of the journalists I admire and respect most in the United States. So I'm very touched. And I'm always touched to speak in a church, despite my own troubled relationship with the Presbyterian Church. I was a Presbyterian seminarian at Harvard, but felt, as my father, who was, as Bob said, a minister, that I was called to write rather than lead a congregation. And when I graduated, you're approved for ordination before you go to seminary. I had to meet with my committee and tell them what my call was, and in order to be ordained. And I remember when the committee asked me what my call was, I told them I was going to go to Central America as a freelance reporter and cover the war in El Salvador. There was a long silence, and the head of the committee said, "We don't ordain journalists." So that was the end of my relationship with the Presbyterian Church. And I think in some ways it must have been somewhat painful for my dad to watch me go that far in the ministry and then finally not follow his vocation. But as Bob said, he certainly gave me a moral grounding. And he himself was pushed out of the church, not because of the civil rights movement or even the anti-war movement, but because of the gay rights movement. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay, and my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s. And at that point, he had a church in Syracuse. And when he found out there was no gay and lesbian organization at Colgate, where I was an undergraduate, an hour away, he brought the gay speakers to the campus. And this led, as Bob said, after several meetings with groups of students, with gay activists, to students confiding in my father that they were too uncomfortable forming a gay and lesbian organization. So my father came and told me I had to found it, which I did. But I tell that story because his outspokenness for gender equality, it became apparent that he was finished in the church. And he did this amazing thing. He refused to back down, and it was the lesson that fortified me years later with the New York Times. And instead of bowing to that pressure, one Easter, he announced that he was holding a public Easter service for all GBTL in the city of Syracuse. And he came and got me at Colgate because he told me that it'd probably be the last time I heard him preach. And he got up and he said, Marriage is a sacrament. It is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that refuses to honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian. And everything I do is by the standard that he set. This book that Joe Sacco and I don't know how many of you know Joe's work. We met in Bosnia in 1995 when I was covering the war for the New York Times. And Joe was working on his book, A Safe Area, Garage. And I'm not, or was not, particularly literate in graphic novels, but I certainly understood a brilliant journalist when I saw one. We subsequently did a long piece for Harper's out of the refugee camp in Gaza called Hani Yunus, and then later a piece for The Nation on Camden. And as I was, the books have a kind of natural progression. I had done a book called Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, about how we have unplugged ourselves from reality, the self-delusion of American culture, the lies we tell ourselves about ourselves, the magical thinking that reality is never an impediment to what we desire, followed by a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which looked at the pillars of the liberal establishment and how they have all collapsed. The book focuses quite a bit on World War I because it was a seminal moment in American history when the corporate or capitalist elite understood that they had to break movements, radical, progressive, popular movements that were threatening their hold on power. Before World War I, of course, we had 70 socialist mayors. Eugene Debs in 1912 pulled 900,000 or 6% of the vote. Some of the most widely read publications in the country, including Appeal to Reason, were socialist publications. We had the Wobblies, the old CIO, figures like Mother Jones, Big Bill Haywood, Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams. And what happened, and I think the echoes of what happened have reverberated down to today, is that Wilson, led by Walter Lippmann, a sort of grand inquisitor of the American intellectual class, understood by employing the investigations into crowd psychology by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and Sigmund Freud, that people were not moved by fact or reason. They were moved by the manipulation of emotion, what Lippmann calls manufacturing consent. That's where Herman and Chomsky get the title of their book on the press from. And so they set up the Creel Commission, or the Committee for Public Information, which churns out this sophisticated propaganda, its own film division in Hollywood, making films like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin, speakers bureaus, its own news bureaus that every day are churning out pro-war stories. And when you read Bourne and you read Adams, one of the undercurrents of despair is how easily the intellectual class are seduced into the war effort, which is precisely what Lippmann understood. And those recalcitrant figures, like Debs, are eventually imprisoned. So they only have to use the Espionage Act or the Sedition Act for those marginal figures who retain their intellectual and personal integrity. And there's a writer that I like very much, Dwight MacDonald, not read a lot anymore. He ran a magazine called Politics after the war, and if any of you know Chomsky's history, Chomsky credits his political awakening to that magazine, Politics, which published Orwell, Bettelheim, Hannah Arendt, and others. But MacDonald, when he looks back at that period, says that populist movements, radical movements, the war was the rock on which they were broken. And immediately after the war, the members of the Committee for Public Information head straight to Wall Street and start working for corporations to upend traditional American values of thrift, self-effacement, and replace it with the cult of the self and with the installation of consumption as a kind of inner compulsion. And I think today when we speak about American culture, what we're really speaking about is corporate culture. And at the same time, the dreaded Hun became the dreaded Red. And we entered what MacDonald calls the kind of psychosis of permanent war, that constant search for the internal and the external enemy. And as MacDonald points out, none of the political theorists, including Karl Marx, anticipated the psychosis of permanent war, which MacDonald says has the capacity to get the masses to call for their own enslavement. Now, the destruction of these radical and progressive movements, which was finally culminated after World War II with the House On-American Affairs activity, thousands of university professors, high school teachers, social workers. It used to be that social workers advocated the unions on behalf of their clients, artists, directors, writers, musicians, journalists, like I.F. Stone, who becomes a pariah, cannot even get a job at The Nation magazine and starts I.F. Stone's Weekly in the basement, are pushed out of the system. The radical movements are destroyed, dismantled, and liberal institutions are effectively disemboweled. Now, the liberal class was never designed to be the political left. And as Howard Zinn does a wonderful job of sort of laying this out in the People's History of the United States, but all of the openings or correctives to American democracy came through movements that never achieved political power. The Liberty Party that fought for slavery, the suffragists who fought for women's rights, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. The liberal class made incremental or piecemeal reform possible. It functioned as a kind of safety valve. And when Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. That's what a liberal class is designed to do. Chomsky makes this point, constantly, and he's correct. They set the parameters by which acceptable debate and of course, you're never allowed to challenge the virtues of the ruling class. So if there's a retrospective on the Vietnam War, then we didn't anticipate the insurgency, or if there's a retrospect on the Iraq War, it's the same kind of language. But to remain within the parameters of the establishable class is not to challenge the motives of the power elite. And when there are legitimate grievances, to ameliorate those grievances enough to maintain control. When the liberal class breaks down, and this is a constant theme in Dostoevsky, it's what Demons is about, his novel Demons, it's what Notes from Underground is about. Mouseman in Notes from Underground is the figure who went to all the Obama rallies and chanted, "Yes, we can," and is now retreated into cynicism and disgust. And when that liberal center doesn't work, when that safety valve doesn't work, you enter, in Dostoevsky's words, an age of moral nihilism. That political paralysis which of course characterizes our political system, is exceedingly dangerous. And so after writing The Death of the Liberal Class and Empire of Illusion, it seemed that the natural progression was to walk into those pockets or zones of the country that were sacrificed first to the marketplace, to corporate capitalism, that were made to kneel before the mania for profit, because they went first and we're going next. There are no impediments left. There is no mechanism within the formal structures of power to ameliorate the suffering and injustices that are being visited on tens of millions of Americans. The harvesting of the country, in essence.